Okay. Good morning, everyone. Okay, to those in the auditorium and also online. Welcome all of you to the PIER Economic Seminar. Okay, and it is our great pleasure today to have speakers from the Asian Development Bank or the ADB. Okay, so they are going to share their work on the entrepreneurship in the digital age. Okay, but before I let them speak, okay, let me give a brief introduction of them. Okay, so we have two speakers today. First is Dr. Donghyun Park. Okay, Dr. Park is the economics advisor for strategic knowledge initiatives at the Economics Research and Regional Cooperation Department of the ADB. And before joining the ADB, he was as Associate Professor of Economics at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Dr. Park has a PhD in economics from the UCLA, and his research revolves around the policy-oriented topics relevant for Asia's long-term development, including innovation, entrepreneurship, and also green growth. As for the second speaker, okay, Dr. Yothin Tinjarak. Okay, Dr. Yothin is a senior economist in the research department of the ADB. He is currently working on the macroeconomics and the development topics, including domestic resource mobilization and entrepreneurship in the developing Asia. And before joining the ADB, Dr. Yothin has work experiences in the academia as well as the multilateral organizations, and he has the PhD in economics from the UC Santa Cruz in the US. Okay, and for the format of the presentation today, okay, Dr. Yothin is going to talk for around like 40 or 45 minutes, and the rest 15 or 20 minutes will be the Q&A. Okay, so without any further ado, okay, I will give the floor to Dr. Yothin. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nuwat, and also thank you to Dr. Nada and Kunamila and the team from the PIER Park Institute for kindly organizing this event for me and Dr. Park. Now, before we start, please allow me to say a few words on to express my sadness on what happened yesterday at the Child Care Center in the Jangwat Nong Bolampu. So we all shocked by the incidents that taking the lives and gentle souls of many kids and teachers at the Child Care Center. And I trust that we all standing and continue to do so in the coming days. Our sincere condolences to the family and hope they recover quickly. Okay, right. Let me start now. So this is our recent report released 2 weeks ago, together with the Asian Development Outlook Update 2022. So in this report, we are looking at the issue of entrepreneurship and digitization, and we call this report Entrepreneurship in the Digital Age. Now, before we go into the report itself, let me, all right, the clicker is not cooperating. Yeah, let me try. Okay. Okay, now it's working. All right. Let me talk briefly about the outlook of the ADB. So this is the latest outlook of economic growth and inflation. Well, growth first in the developing economies of Asia. So this year, the latest forecast of the ADB is that the developing Asia would be growing in 2022 at the rate of 4.3%. And next year, 2023, that will be 4.9%. So this is a lower forecast than what we had in April. The adjustment downward is due mainly to the slowing down in the China and also in South Asia due to India, together with the contraction in the Sri Lanka. And this is the first time in 3 decades that the rest of developing Asia will be growing faster than the PRC China. In 3 decades, the rest of Asia will be growing faster than in China. For the rest of Asia, we are seeing that in Southeast Asia, compared to our outlook in the April, growth in Southeast Asia is more or less the same in terms of the forecast this year and next, about 5%. For the Caucasus and Central Asia, we are seeing growth over there as improving because apparently the many economies in the Caucasus and Central Asia has not been badly affected by the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. In fact, some economies over there are receiving inflows of capital and labor from Russia. And then if we look further out to the Pacific, the growth over there is quite positive because they are the tourism economies, and now they start receiving back the tourists. So compared to the rest of the Asia, probably the China is the one that is currently slowing down. Right. So that is the outlook of Asia that the ADB forecast for this year and next. Oh, and for inflation, we are seeing inflation because this is a Central Bank of Thailand, right? So we have to mention about inflation. So inflation in Asia this year, we are forecasting it at 4.5%, and next year will be around 4%. So in the main report, we also have the detailed country chapters that you're all welcome to look at. Right, now let's jump into the report. So this is the report about entrepreneurship in the digitalization era, entrepreneurship in the digital age. Why do we care about entrepreneurship? Well, we care about entrepreneurship because we need the vibrant private sector, right, for the growth of the economy. And then to have that vibrant private sector, we need innovative firms and entrepreneurs. Now, the picture over there, I think you're familiar with that face, right? That's the picture of Professor Sahin of BioNTech, the entrepreneurs who team up with the Pfizer's. And that venture did make a difference, no? I got 2 shots on my arms, Pfizer. I think Dr. Park just got one 2 weeks ago in South Korea, right? And so that entrepreneurship did make a difference. So it's a good example of entrepreneurship, and it's important to our development. And but this is not the only example, right? We see many entrepreneurs, new entrepreneurs coming online during the pandemic. Not least because of the help of digitization. So this process, if anything, has been sped up during the pandemic period. So we are going to look at this across Asia, so what is happening compared to the rest of the world. To give you another example, this is a example of entrepreneurs that try to apply the science and physics principle to help with the social development goals. This is the company called the Ocean Cleanup. It's a company started by the entrepreneurs named Boyan Slat. So he applied the physics principles using the water currents to clean up the plastic garbage in the Pacific Ocean. Right. So this is a good example, right? That entrepreneurs, they can pursue their dream and at the same time help with the social and sustainable development goals. Okay. Right. Now let's look at the data. We care about entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship in the digital age. But then let's see what the data is telling us. So we start with quite a broad picture, looking at the international cross-country data. So a national starting point would be, well, looking at what is the relationship between the rate of entrepreneurial activities and economic growth. Now, the scatter plot that we are showing you over there is scatter plot of the entrepreneurship rate on the x-axis and GDP growth on the y-axis. Now, this is a cross-country data, well, panel data for 2 decades. And what we are seeing is the somewhat positive relationship, right? If anything, the red dots, by the way, are developing economies. The blue dots are developed economies. So in the panel data, we see some positive relationship, but it's relatively weak. And this is a total rate of entrepreneurship. It's the percent of entrepreneurs from the working age population. So given this weak relationship, you may wonder, what else can we learn, right? From the link from entrepreneurship to economic growth. Let me mention one first. When we think about entrepreneurs, there are 2 types of entrepreneurs mainly. Those who are pursuing opportunities with the ideas and innovation. We can call that the opportunity-driven entrepreneurs, right? And there is another group that is pursuing entrepreneurship out of necessity, subsistence level kind of entrepreneurship, and we can call that the necessity-driven entrepreneurs. And you may expect, right, that their contribution to the economic development and growth could be quite different, right? Those driven by opportunity and those driven by necessity. And we have the data of that as well. Right, let's look at another set of macro data. This is the data showing the firm size distribution and number of jobs created. Now, we are showing you this because just like the previous slide that we recently showed, it's difficult to detect the link from entrepreneurship to growth because there are many types of entrepreneurs, right? Some driven by opportunity, some driven by necessity. And therefore, when you think about entrepreneurship and development, we have to think in terms of quality of entrepreneurs or quality of entrepreneurship, not just the quantity, right? In fact, to be fair, it should be both quantity and quality. So one good example is that if you think about the numbers or quantity of entrepreneurs, right? Can you guess which country is the most populous in terms of entrepreneurs? Happens to be the Peru and Zambia, right? That's in terms of the quantity of entrepreneurs in the data that we have. So this is a good reasons, right? When you think of entrepreneurs, not only quantity, but quality as well. So this table shows the firm size distributions. And looking across the rows, you see that in the first column, we have firm size going from 1 to 2 employees all the way to 250 and above. Now, what I want to highlight is the jobs created by these firms, right? If you look at the top row, firm size above 250 employees, they account for only the 0.4% of the firm that we look at in the sample. By the way, this is from about 15,000 firms in total. So firms with the 20, 50 and above employees accounted for 0.4% of the sample, but they contribute to the more than 40% of jobs created. So a few selected firms contribute more significantly than the rest, right? So it's, again, a good example of quality, not quantity, that matters for entrepreneurship and economic development. Okay, so that gives some good reasons why we need to look more closely into this issue and how it's important in developing Asia. Okay. Right, so in this report, we will be looking at both the macro and micro data. Now, to go about analyzing the data, we need to think about some framework, right? Some handle before jumping into the data. So when we think about entrepreneurship and economic development, we can think of, well, what was the role of ICT and digitization, right? When we think about the ICT and digitization, we think of how that influence the activities of firms, entrepreneurs, all the way from the back office to the front office. With the ICT and digitization, you can think of activities that can move online and digitized. For example, when you want to collect the information about your customer and clients, this can be done online, right? When you want to interact with your clients, customers, and after-sales services, this can be done online. You can even track your customer and performance of your products in real time, online, right, using the digital technology. So this is a broad conceptual framework that we will be using when we jump into the macro and micro data. Right. Now let's start with the cross-country data. So just looking at the entrepreneurship and economic growth couldn't tell us much about the relationship. So now we are going to look into some more specific factors that would influence entrepreneurships. So to do that, with the macro data, cross-country data, we would organize the variables or conditions into 8 pillars. So we all work with the macro data, and we know that there are like hundreds, right, of variables, institutionals and macro variables that we can look into. So with all those variables, we organize them into 8 pillars. And these 8 pillars are the pillars that are important to the entrepreneurship. This includes culture, institution, market conditions, infrastructure, human capital, knowledge creation and dissemination, finance, and networking supports. So these are the 8 pillars that we organize all the hundreds of variables out there, and then used to understand the patterns of entrepreneurship and economic development. Now we are doing this for more than 100 economies. Well, to be more specific, it's 113 global economies. Not all of them, because all of them would be 200 or so, right? But these are the 113 economies that we have the data. The precursor of this analysis is the one done by the European Commission. They have a European Index of Digital Entrepreneurship System. So what we did is to construct the index. They had the European version, we have the global version. So now we have the global index of digital entrepreneurship system called the GIDS index, right? Okay, I hope you're ready. Next would be the results of this index. Okay, so this is the index that we construct, but because there are so many countries in the index, we take the snapshot of this index and showing you. Now in this table, right, this is the top group. Out of 113 economies, these are the top group. So it's the top of the crop, right? And if you notice who's in the top row, well, Singapore, right? Singapore is in the top. So Singapore is the top of 113 economies when it comes to the conditions for the entrepreneurship in the digital age. And if you notice in this top group, the rest comes from North America and Europe, right? So only Singapore from Asia pop in that top group. There are the 4 more groups, the second, third, fourth, and fifth group. From Asia, South Korea is in the second group. Then in the third group, we got China and Malaysia. Thailand is in the fourth group. And then the rest of Asia, we have about 21 economies that we have the data from Asia. The rest of Asia is in the final group, the fifth group. Therefore, the results of this index construction based on hundreds of variables is that when it comes to the environment for doing entrepreneurship in the digital age, it's Singapore that pop in the top group, and the rest of Asia is following and catching up. Right. We will come back to why this is important later. But let me also show you our analysis using this index, right? So now we have the index that look specifically at the condition for entrepreneurship, the GIDS index. So we can now map this index onto the firm level data, entrepreneur level data, and then see the link from entrepreneurship to the performance of business. And that should give us a clearer picture on the entrepreneurship and economic development. So just to give you a snapshot of the result that we got. So if we look at the bar on the leftmost bar, this is the results of the statistical analysis of the link from our index, the GIDS index, that measure entrepreneurial environment and the probability of a new business introducing new products. So when we think about development and growth, we think about innovative firms and entrepreneurs, right? Now, the likelihood that firms would be introducing new product is one of that measures. In the data and in the background paper, we also look at the likelihood that firm will be exporting their products. Also, the likelihood that the firms will create new jobs. But showing you here is the likelihood that they would introduce new products. And what we are seeing is that, just look at the first bar on the left, it is saying that there's a positive association between the good quality of entrepreneurial environment and the likelihood of new firms introducing new products. And therefore, this is one of the evidence that entrepreneurship contributes to economic growth in Asia. Right. So the effect is quite economically significant, 8.2. If you increase this index by 1 standard deviation, you likely see the 8.2% increase in the probability of new business introducing new products. Okay, so that is the macro data, right? But when we do research, we want to see both the macro and micro data. And that is exactly what we did in this report. Now, next we're going to jump into the micro data. Now, to look at the micro data, we went out talking to entrepreneurs, doing the surveys and interviews. We work with local scholars in the 6 ASEAN economies. Now, before going into detail, let me mention briefly the kind of framework that we imposed on the interviews and survey. So when we think about digitization and entrepreneurship and how that map onto the economic performance and growth, there can be 2 effects, right? Direct and indirect. Now, with the availability of digital technology and ICT, this widened the scope of entrepreneurship. Think about the millions of mobile phone apps available out there. It could be Google apps or iTunes apps, what have you, right? And that is considered direct effect. Right? Now, the other effect that we have is the indirect effect, going from digitization to the performance of firms and entrepreneurs. Think about having all these online tools and ICT available at your disposal. It means that if you have ideas, right, you can experiment with your idea, test it online, monitor your customer reaction, and then improve your performance. And that would be the sort of indirect effect going from digitization to business performance, the experimentation of ideas. So both direct and indirect effects are testable effects when it comes to the link going from digitization to performance of entrepreneurs. And that would give us a clear picture on how entrepreneurship contributes to economic development. Again, our bottom line is that it's the quality, not quantity of entrepreneurship that matters, right? Okay. Now, we went out and talked to entrepreneurs, but to do that, we need help, right? Now, this report was done during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. So from 2020 to 2021, and part of 2022, we work with scholars in 6 ASEAN economies, including Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, the 6, right? by the way, one of local scholars that we work with is already in this room, Dr. Chirapon from Singapore Management University. So we work with the local scholars in these respective ASEAN economies and set up a team. And this team would go out, talk and interview with the entrepreneurs. And in total, we have close to 700 entrepreneurs from the 6 ASEAN economies that we talk to. Now, we asked them hundreds of questions, right, in the surveys, and you are all welcome to go on the ADB website and look at the full report, where we also publish the list of questions that we talk to the entrepreneurs. But what I want to highlight here is the results that we got from that interview and surveys. So again, we want to know, right, how the digitization affect the performance of entrepreneurs. So we therefore ask questions related to that aspect of entrepreneurship. So, for example, we ask questions, things like, well, we ask entrepreneurs, say, well, when it comes to your perception in terms of your contribution to social sustainability, is that affected by how you experiment your business model with the digitization? And the result is quite positive. So there's a positive association going from entrepreneurs in our survey experimenting with the digitization and their contribution to the social sustainability. There are also other questions that we asked them, things like, do you rely on the mobile and web applications? And if so, whether that is the link to their performance in terms of contributing to the sustainable development goals. And also we also ask them, if you experiment your ideas and products and business model with the digitization, would that improve your bottom line business performance comparing to your peers in the industries? And also the results are positive. So using this micro survey data, we also see that indeed in the developing Asias, there's a positive link going from firms using the digitization and their performance, not only their bottom line business profitability, but also the contribution to the social sustainability. So in the survey, we also asked many other questions to control for before we arrive at this simple bar charts, things like how you form your team, whether your team is diverse, having a gender balance, experience from overseas, and so on, right? Where you get the funding. So there are many more questions, and we control for that before we arrive at these effects that we are showing you. Right. Now, when we look at the data, the micro level data, just these 6 economies, right? We notice that although there's quite supportive and positive findings showing that the entrepreneurships contribute to economic growth, and on the top of that, the digitization help, right? But then there are differences across the economies. So just these 6 economies, when we map them into different metrics, for example, in this spider web diagram, we are looking at differences across the 6 economies using the entrepreneurial level data in terms of how they experiment with their business model. And the result shows that according to that metric, although we have many other metrics and pillars, right? But according to the metric looking at business model experimentation, Singaporean entrepreneurs are coming on top compared to the other 5 ASEAN entrepreneurs. And then in talking to the entrepreneurs in six economies through the scholars that we work with, there are also many other interesting patterns. For example, when we talk to Dr. Chirapon and the team in Singapore, of course, one area that is very active in Singapore is the fintech and startups, right? Then if we move on to Indonesia, one area that is more significantly active compared to the other is the food delivery and services. That's Indonesia. For Malaysia, this is interesting. Malaysia is very advanced and active when it comes to new startups and entrepreneurs in the drone technology. Right? So now Malaysia is exporting some drone technology to the rest of the world. For Thailand, is the health and tourism that is the standing out, and for Vietnam is the education sector that is the popping out from the survey and the interviews. So yes, in the micro data and surveys, we also see many nuance and differences that is what we're looking into as an extension, of course. Okay. All right. Now, not only the differences across the countries that we observed, we also observe differences across time when it comes to the effect of digitization and entrepreneurship. Now, what do you think about the effect of digitization, the entrepreneurship during the COVID-19 pandemic? There are many ways to ask that question, right? And to test that question. Now, one way is to look at how firms perform during the COVID-19 pandemic, with and without website ownership, right? So we have this new data from the World Bank. It's a firm level data of more than 12,000 firms in 32 countries and 28 industries. And this is the very new data. Is looking at many metrics at the firm level from May to September 2020. Right now, one of the variable that is quite of interest to us is whether these entrepreneurs or firms own a website or not. Right? And if they own a website or not, contribute to the survivability during the pandemic. So we run a test doing regressions across these more than 12,000 firms, and we find that. So in this diagram, it shows the association between owning a website and the likelihood that firm remaining open or permanently closed or temporarily closed. And we find that, well, indeed, if firms own a website, there's a higher likelihood that they would stay open and less likely that they would permanently close. So, well, having a website helped during the pandemic crisis. So that is another benefit of ICT and digitization during the pandemic period. Okay, now I think we talk a lot about entrepreneurship and the benefits of digitization, right? But when it comes to the role of entrepreneurship and digitization, I think we cannot lose track of one underlying fundamentals. And that fundamental is the institutions, right? So even before digitization become playing a big role, we all know about the role of institutions, how it's important to the economic development. Now, if we think about the role of institutions and entrepreneurships, we can think about institutions in two ways, right? So when we look at institutions, what comes to mind tend to be variables like regulation of entry, rule of laws, and financial conditions. These are important institutional factors. They help organize economic activities. And of course, with that, they would affect how firms and entrepreneurs perform, whether it's in the context of new product introduction, export activities, or job creations. So that is one way to think about the effect of institutions to the entrepreneur performance. The other way to think about is that institutions also incentivize, right, the investment in important factors, things like educations and investment in general, including the infrastructure that we include in our GIDS index. So institutions should still play quite an important role when we think about entrepreneurship and the economic development. So now, to not lose sight on that, we're also looking at how entrepreneurs in Asia, right, perform if we condition for the institutions. So we are looking at more than 200,000 individuals in the 15 DMC. In the context of the ADB, DMC means the developing member countries, right? So we got this data from the 15 developing countries in Asia. And then we look at how the conditions at the country levels, factors like private credit ratio, which is the measure of financial system, rule of laws, and also business registration costs are associated with the performance of entrepreneurs. And what we are seeing here is that if, for example, we improve the rule of law, this is the one in the middle, the bar in the middle. If we improve the rule of law in Asia by, on average, by one standard deviation, that is associated with about a 5.4% increase in the likelihood that new business introducing new products, which is one of our measure of innovative entrepreneurship. Right? So this is one good evidence of institutions still playing important role when it comes to the entrepreneurship. The other way to think about institution is to look at the opposite of good institution, which is the corruption, right? Now, I think looking at corruption is very, very interesting because the link between the corruptions and entrepreneurships are quite subtle in a way. And the effect can go both ways, right? From corruption to entrepreneurship and from entrepreneurship to the corruption. First, think about how corruption would influence entrepreneurship. It can be both positive and negative, right? Think about in the country where corruption is pretty bad. It means that entrepreneurs will have to jump through many hoops before they can release and launch their business, right? Now, with that low corruption, it means that to overcome the red tapes, the entrepreneurs may have to use or to go around the corrupt system, make use of corrupt system, such that the corruption becomes the grease in the wheel of the entrepreneurship. Right. But then if you think about corruption and entrepreneurship, right, the effect from corruption to entrepreneurship, it could also be negative, right? Instead of helping the entrepreneurs to go around the system quickly, it could be the sand in the gears of entrepreneurships. Think about you graduate from universities, you got these new ideas that you develop with your friends. It takes years. And then at the final stage, before you going to launch your new product, some corrupted officials asking you for some bribes. So that just throw everything off, right? So in this sense, the corruption works like the sand in the gears. So the link from corruption to entrepreneurships can be both positive and negative. And at the same time, entrepreneurship can also influence the corruption. Think about in the system where corruption is everywhere, right? In economies where corruption is everywhere. Now, for entrepreneurs to success, it's not going to be about how innovative or how competitive they are, right? They will just make use of corruption to be on the top and to be ahead of their competitors. In that sense, the entrepreneurship can breed corruption. Kind of makes sense, right? But at the same time, if you think about the entrepreneurship that is very innovative and vibrant, if they have enough mass, right, they can change things around. That is with the vibrant private sector and active entrepreneurship in economies, it can weaken the corruption. So the bottom line is that the link between the two are both ways, right? Two-way feedbacks, and it can be both positive and negative. So this is a testable hypothesis. And Dr. Park and his team went out, run some statistical analysis across countries, and he found that when we think about corruption and entrepreneurship, indeed there is a strong link between the two. Now, to show in this diagram is the increase in the entry rate of new firms, right? And how corruption affect this entry rate of new firms. Now, to quantify it in terms of economic significance, in developing Asia, right? If we decrease corruption by 1 standard deviation, now corruption is the leftmost bar. If we decrease corruption by 1 standard deviation, on average, we will see that that is associated with an increase of close to 10 percentage point improvement in the entry rate of new firms. So this is, I think, a good example of how institutions and corruptions affects the entrepreneurship. So it's not only about digital technology and ICT, but also corruption and institution. Okay, I think we coming to the final part of presentation. So I would like to come back to that index that we construct in this report, the new index, global index that we construct, the GIDS index. So just to recap, in this index of 113 global economies, we have about 21 Asian developing countries in that index, right? The rest, we just don't have the data. Now, when we look at this index, Singapore coming on top, right? Not only top of Asia, but top of the world, right? Then we have South Korea in the second group. This orange bar is you see the South Korea. But then even in the second group, South Korea is being ranked 22. Then in the third group, we have China and Malaysia, right? Now, can you see the Thailand? If you try to look closely at this diagram, I think Thailand is over here, ranked 59 out of 113. It's in the third group, the green group, right? And then the rest of Asia that we got the data are in the final group, the fifth group. So there's a lot of catching up to do, right? To promote entrepreneurship in this digital age. Now, to do the catch up, based on our look and analysis of the data, we are seeing that that catch up need to be supported by a broad policy mix. Now, in this diagram, we are showing the, you may recall at the beginning, we talked about the 8 pillars, right? We got hundreds of variables and then we organized to 8 pillars from infrastructure, institutions to culture. So we look at these 8 pillars and look at how Asia, right? Asia on average, compared to the world average. Now look at the bar on the leftmost. This is the Asia average compared to the world average. So we are really close to the world average. This is 99.1%. So relatively, Asia is doing pretty good when it comes to the physical infrastructure. And this shouldn't be a surprise, right? Because in Asia, we invest a lot in infrastructure. But if you look all the way to the rightmost bar, this is the culture and institutions. What we are seeing that this is the one that Asia is lagging behind the most when compared to the rest of the world. And this should be improved. It can be done, for example, through the education system. That is one way, and we can come back to that during the Q&A. But just to point it out that if Asia wants to catch up with Singapore and the rest of the world, the policy mix should be broad. We also have this similar diagram for each country, say for Thailand, for Indonesia, and so on. So it will look different for Thailand, but this is for Asia in general. Okay, in the interest of time, maybe let me jump to this final slide, in fact. So the bottom line of this report is that entrepreneurship, we see in this report and data analysis, entrepreneurship is important to the economic growth and development. And we see an important role of digitization, in particular during this pandemic period. This process has been sped up very quickly. So I think going forward for Asia to catch up with the rest of the world, and to have more people like, well, in this slide, you see that you recognize this face, right? Jack Ma of Alibaba. To have more people like this, or to have more people like Boon-Chul Lee of Samsung, who start the business that help essentially move South Korea from the middle income economy to the high income economy. or to have more people like M.R. Narayana of Infosys of India. Policymakers and governments in Asia need to do a lot of catch up. Now, of course, when it comes to the supporting entrepreneurs, the government is not in a position to select or handpick the winners or entrepreneurs, right? That has to be left to the market to do the job. But what the governments and policymakers in Asia can do is to create that environment that's supportive and inducive to the entrepreneurship in Asia. And in this report, we provide several measures and metrics that we hope would help the policymaker to make the informed decisions. So let me end here, and we would be happy to discuss. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Dr. Yotin, for sharing us a very interesting work. Okay, so now we have 15 minutes for the Q&A. For those in the auditorium, okay, please raise your hand, and I'm going to hand in the microphone. But for those online, okay, please use the raise hand buttons. Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. And I wonder for the 8 pillar that you study, have you study which pillar has a biggest effect on the growth or on the entrepreneurship? Let's say suppose the government want to improve the entrepreneurship in Thailand. Which pillar that they should focus on?
Thank you for the questions. So when we look at these 8 pillars, right, going from infrastructure all the way to culture and informal institutions, I think that question is very important because this is for Asia on average, right, compared to the rest of the world. But for Thailand, it looked different. And in the full report, it does look different because for Thailand, the one that performed best is the networking. The score for Thailand is quite high on the networking, but apparently it's very low on the physical infrastructure compared to the other pillars. But having said that, networking in Thailand is doing relatively better than the other pillars, but it's still, in terms of a score, it's still half that of South Korea. So there's still a gap to catch up, not only in terms of infrastructure, but even for the one that we are doing relatively well, we're still well behind countries like South Korea and Singapore, right? So yeah, so that would be my take on how the government should. But then when we think about how the government should put the resources, right? That's another part of your questions, right? Into promoting these conditions. I think you're right that some area has to be prioritized. For example, if infrastructure is well behind the rest of the world, then the infrastructure should be prioritized. But at the same time, these conditions are all related, right? So one cannot just put resources into one pillar and overlook the other. So it has to be quite well balanced. But if you want to prioritize, I would say in the case of Thailand, it's the infrastructure, because that is jumping out from the report. It's doing worse than the other pillars when it comes to Thailand, and even much worse when it comes to leading economies in Asia like South Korea and Singapore. Yeah.
I have one follow-up question. So in the earlier of your presentation, you also talk about the ease of starting a business, right? And how that could help innovative entrepreneur. And you also mentioned about the corruption and the starting a business, right? So I wonder if these two things could be related. Let's say if the government or if any country have a lot of red tape that the startup had to overcome, right? That might be a room for corruption. So I don't know if you consider these two factors together, whether are they correlated between the red tape and the corruption.
Yeah. Dr. Park, do you want to take a shot? Okay, all right. Yes, I think just like you said, right? there are two-way relationship going from corruption and the entrepreneurships. I think what we'll just highlight is that if you think about the highly corrupted economies, right, and if you think in the context of Asia, right, in that environment, corruption can be the sand in the gears for entrepreneurs. Just like the example that we used earlier, you work on this business model for years with your friends. You develop what have you, blockchain or AI, but then at the end of the process, you bump into these government officials that ask you for 70% of the pie, right? So that could happen, and that could just throw everything off. So that will be the stand in the gears for the entrepreneurships. And I think that last week at the BOT Symposium, there was one session talking about how regulation and red tape kind of slowing things down, right? So I call that a quite important aspect from the symposium. But then at the same time, if you think about entrepreneurship, right? It means that in the highly corrupted economies, that gives a good reasons why we should promote entrepreneurship, because with the vibrant communities of entrepreneurs and networking, it could help the weakening or dampening corruption. Because at the end, well, who's going to succeed in this environment and community is the one that is competitive and innovative. And that's kind of draining out the resource from the corrupted system in a way, right? So corrupted official wouldn't have room or even the way to entertain the entrepreneurs if they are all very competitive and innovative and have a very strong communities, right? And this, I think, in a way, is something that Thailand is doing as well. Yeah.
Just a follow-up question on corruption. So I just curious about the narration here. So alternative view might be that whether to corrupt depends on whether it's the optimal strategy of the firms, whether they want to just pay something on the table to get things done. And this rate of corruption might also reflect quality of institution. So if you go to the next slide, when you show the results, that the lower of corruption would increase the entry rate of new firms, would this actually reflected in better institutional quality? And if you control the institutional quality in this analysis, then what would be the interpretation of given the same institution? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think I get what you mean. So it means that corruption is bad, but if we lower corruption, then at some point it will be quite settled or optimal, right? So that it could increase the entry rate any further.
Oh no, no. What I meant is that they underlying this findings might be the relationship between the corruption and the quality of the institution, right? So I just wonder whether this study control for the quality of institutions.
Quality of the institutions. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Actually, this is a separate analysis focusing on corruption, and here corruption is one important measure of the quality of institutions. But let me expand a little further. Of course, in principle, we just saw that corruption can either have a positive or negative effect on entrepreneurship. But my personal opinion or view is that it has a very decidedly negative impact on entrepreneurship. And although we saw in theory this, greasing that's from the literature, by the way. Greasing the wheels of entrepreneurship, sand in the gears of entrepreneurship. We have these two opposite views. But if you think about it, even this, corruption, bribing some government official is a way to get around a lot of red tape and a lot of excessive regulation. But even that, if you think about it one level deeper, is corruption, because government bureaucrats in many countries, and even in more advanced countries like Korea, these bureaucrats generate a lot of these unnecessary, pointless regulations precisely, right, as an avenue for corruption. So it's a very circular reasoning. And then in terms of the developing countries, look, why are institutions important? Because digitalization, it reduces the cost of starting a business, right? ICT for sure reduces the cost of entrepreneurship, right? That's why it can catalyze entrepreneurship. What ICT and digitalization cannot do is to reduce the high level of risk and uncertainty that is inherently associated with entrepreneurship. Why am I not an entrepreneur? Why is Yotin not an entrepreneur? Why are most of you not an entrepreneur? Because it's highly risky, right? We all know that 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 new businesses fail. That's why you need strong institutions, like strong rule of law and so forth. And then, but if you think about it at a practical level, it's tough enough to be an entrepreneur, right? Even in the US, right? Even in one of the, I mean, probably the world's most entrepreneurial country, and also China, right? In the Asian context, it's tough enough to be an entrepreneur. But in a developing country, I mean, Yotin kind of alluded to it, it's even tougher, right? Because you have lousy infrastructure, you have unstable electricity, you have bad internet connections if you're a digital entrepreneur. It's tough enough to succeed, right, as an entrepreneur. But say that you are the 1% or the 5% or the 7% that make it. You make it against all odds, right? Being a successful entrepreneur, so difficult, especially in the developing country. You make it, and at the end of the road, some greedy, corrupt government bureaucrat says, oh, give me my 70%. Then you take all the risk, right? And this guy at the end gets 70%. In that kind of environment, nobody in his right mind would choose to become an entrepreneur. So I think it's quite clear intuitively, it's much stronger. The intuition for why corruption is bad for entrepreneurship is much stronger than this theoretical positive relationship between corruption and entrepreneurship. And that's what our cross-country empirical analysis confirms.
Okay, thanks. Okay, now maybe let's take
Okay. Can I ask one question? Or do you have
okay.
Or there are questions online?
Maybe let's take a question from online first, and then Pete Bang. Okay. So Ajahn Mintam.
Okay. Good morning. Everyone can hear me, right? Thank you very much for your very informative presentation. So I find it very fascinating. And just to follow up the point that people are discussing about corruption, I'm wondering that you talk about the two-way relationship between the two, but as we are discussing about the digital development in this context, I'm wondering whether you consider the role of ICT development in this relationship, because obviously the ICT development can somehow reduce the level of corruption from the government sector. We know all about the e-registration in business, the e-reporting in tax. So I'm wondering whether the report take into account the effect of ICT development on corruption and also on entrepreneurship, and then look at the relationship between the two. The same thing happened with the ICT development and access to finance, where we have a lot of the development of the fintechs and financial inclusion, and that also can affect the entrepreneurship. So I'm wondering whether the report addressed that kind of complicated things between the three. Thank you. That's the first point, but I have another one, but just follow up this first point. Thank you.
Okay, so I just have a question about, like, there was one slide saying that you use having a website as a measure of digitalization. I don't know what is it include on having a website, because I think in Thailand companies normally, like, it's gonna be like large companies, like are well established and big companies that have a website. But small companies now, they will use like Facebook or open shops on like Shopee. Do we call like those companies as like being digitalized as well?
Let me take the second question. I think Yotin can answer the earlier question about the additional question about entrepreneurship, although I can add to that if necessary. We also, by the way, have some analysis looking at social media presence, like what you just mentioned. And that also has a positive impact on that reduces the likelihood of being closed, and it increases the likelihood of being open. So we just show web pages because everybody knows web pages, but we also do the same analysis for social media presence, including Facebook, and we find the same, qualitatively same result. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Park. So to go back to the first question by Ajahn Min Tam, right? I think that's a very good question to look at the role ICT on the corruption. Just to firm up, Dr. Park, in the background paper, we did control for ICT, right? ICT direct, yes, yeah, yes, okay, yes. So in that background paper, Dr. Park and his team didn't address directly the role of institutions on the corruptions, which I think is very important, as the Ajahn Min Tam asked. But I think you already answered that question, right? You pointed out to the role of ICT in the tax collection, VAT, for example, right? In Thailand, everything going online and digitized, and I think that would help reducing the red tape and also if any, reducing the corruption. And in Asia, we are also seeing many economies trying to use this ICT and digitization to reduce all this red tape and the potential for corruptions in many other areas, including if you think about the property tax, for example, right? These days, there are many economies already that exploring with using the satellite image data to map the properties, size, and so on, in order to help with the collection of property taxes. And therefore, that should also reduce the red tape and corruption as well. So I think you already answered that question, Professor Min Tam. But empirically, we haven't looked at that yet, and therefore that is the good extension for the study.
Yeah, just to repeat, we haven't done that analysis, but I think for that one, the broader research agenda, future research agenda, is the impact of ICT on corruption. I think that's the agenda we would look at, for example, through electronic filing of tax payments. Thank you.
Thank you, Kap.
Okay, I think we have had quite a fruitful 1 hour discussion. So on behalf of the PIER Park Research Institute, I would like to thank both speakers from the ADB for coming to share with us your work. Yeah, we have learned a lot about the concept and the empirical work, how the digitization and institution affect the performance of the firms. So thank you very much for coming here, and yeah, hope to see you again.
Thank you, Kap. ขอบคุณครับ